Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
There was a big celebration going on in the square. Many people gathered there to watch the puppet theater that had come especially for the celebration. It was a period of turmoil and no other. A collection of villains overthrew the emperor, and the nation was ultimately threatened. That's how this story began. The man who played the role of the puppet asked the audience what would be the best way to solve the problem. People immediately started shouting out various options, and he wondered, wouldn't there be any heroes to save the poor emperor? However, at that moment, a knight suddenly appeared, and his name was Thunderous. It was the golden-haired Joan of Arc. At that moment, another doll with bright hair and armor came on stage. When people saw this beautiful doll, they were immediately surprised because they thought and imagined her differently. However, she was still pretty cute to them. The man continued his story and said that by destroying the enemies of the empire, she could be called a saint. At that moment, some drunken man approached the vendor who had put out her meat for people to buy, turned to the girl, calling her an ant, and stomped on her goods with his feet, and afterward told her that she owed money for the place and should pay him in full that day. The man continued to tell his story and said that it was only because of this brave knight that they could now sleep in peace. The bully kept pressing Auntie and saying that she had better give up the meat and all the proceeds she had gotten for the day, for he was telling her nicely, and then it would be a bad time for her. However, at that moment, a girl with bright red hair came up behind him and swung at him with her huge piece of meat that she had picked up on the floor. The man continued his story and said that with the end of the war, Joan of Arc disappeared, giving up all honors and awards. The only thing she left behind was a legend, and the skills of combat that were sung everywhere, the art of wielding a sword that could not be followed even by a glance. The girl who came up to deal with the bully threw him a few meters away from the saleswoman. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she had done it in the first place. The girl then said with a smile on her face that with the warming weather, various bugs, especially parasites, had come out. She turned to her aunt, smiling, and told her that she had to be careful, or these vermin would breed even more, and then they would definitely not be kicked out. The man who was attacking the poor aunt got up from his seat and said that she was completely crazy. He called her various uncultured words and asked her how she dared to do that to him. He was about to approach her and avenge his pride when suddenly some knight in uniform ran out of the crowd. He ran up to the girl, whose name was Sarah, and said that the head had warned her not to get into trouble after all. The girl immediately became indignant and said that she actually had nothing to do with it, but had just caught a bug, and that was it. While they were standing there arguing amongst themselves, the bully got to his feet again. Because the knight had pushed him, he fell to the ground. He just watched them in surprise and thought that they were really crazy. But at that moment he looked more closely at their uniforms and saw the coat of arms there, and it was blue blood. Taking a closer look, he realized that blue blood investigator Lorenzo Dominic and blue blood forensic scientist Serrer Geiss were standing in front of him. Lorenzo turned around at this point and would have already wanted to say something to this bully, but he immediately got up and ran away when he realized who they really were. The guy immediately turned to the girl and asked if by bug she meant the guy running away. The girl, sighing heavily, said that it was just like that. He dared to lay his hands on the poor and innocent shopgirl. At this point, the saleswoman turned to Sarah and said that without her, the victory would not have happened, so she was incredibly grateful. She also added that she had fresh meat brought to her just that day, and if it had been taken away, she doesn't even know what would have happened. The girl looked for a while at the piece she continued to hold in her hands and, smiling, told the saleswoman that she would take it. Sarah also added that she couldn't sell it anyway, and she, in turn, would get full. When the saleswoman heard this, she became very angry, for the girl was going to take it away without even paying, and because of this, she shouted loudly at her. Soon after that, the girl returned to the Blood Aristocracy Investigation Department, namely the Kincaid Division. That's where she met her other partner. It was Blue Blood Inspector Noah Windsor. He addressed her in a fatherly manner and said that she was not a gangster or a hooligan. However, she was ruining the reputation of the entire department by her actions. She turned to Noah and asked him to keep his voice down, for she had told him more than once that everything was consensual. He looked at her indignantly and asked, since when was it called that? Because she had just taken the meat from the clerk and never paid for it. Serere wasn't at all happy about being told off like this, so she basically didn't listen to him. At this point, Lorenzo intervened and said that they had received their paychecks only 3 days ago, so she should not be short of money. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked, "Can there really be a paycheck left over that was received so long ago?" The men looked at her in surprise. Lorenzo said, however, that she was at an age when she should be a little more frugal if she was to have enough to live on. The other partner, indignant, asked the girl when she was going to get a grip on her head because she couldn't go on like this. But at that moment, another guy came into the room. He came up behind Sarah and spoke to her. The man was the head of the Blue Bloods, and his name was Villers Petro. He said the case was about the suicide of the Viscount's fiancée, which they had closed last week, and asked if she remembered it. The girl looked at him in surprise and said that of course she remembered. Then Petro said that apparently the Frederick family had given the order to the knights. Serere began to feel a little worried. She didn't show it on her face, however, and smiled and said that it was all nonsense because the judge had given him the death sentence and it simply couldn't happen. The man replied that they were the ones who had gotten the death sentence. Lorenzo, who continued to sit next to them, said that such an outcome was quite possible. However, he did not expect it to happen so soon. Then their chief replied that according to White Blood, those idiots were digging for them, and he thought they were definitely grinding their teeth on them. So he, addressing all his staff, advised them to be more careful at night and to double-check the situation all the time. The boys at once said that this was the way it would be done. However, of course, this was not enough for Petro. So he went up to the girl and, grabbing her by the ear, said that it was especially true for her. He was annoyed by the fact that every day she drank until she passed out. He also added that if they died, it would be her who would be the first to die, because she had no control over her behavior and surroundings. Sarah turned to the head and asked that he let her go, for she was really hurt and completely uncomfortable. Lorenzo at this point was just sitting there watching all of this with a very serious expression on his face. They sat in the building for a while longer, and then went home. The girl turned to her friend and said that the head was so strong that even she was not up to jokes now. She also added that he's going to be 50 years old without 5 minutes, so she doesn't understand how he can still hold up so well. Lorenzo ignored her questions, and she smiled and asked him if he had any more money. She added that she would pay him back before payday and asked him to lend her some because she needed it urgently. But the man looked very serious and even worried. He turned to Sarah and asked her to be careful for a while. He also added that he and the head of their department were of rather large build, but that was also worrisome. However, it was definitely not in his character for men to do stupid things. He looked her straight in the eyes, and now the girl was not even smiling. She listened to him very attentively and seriously. Lorenzo said that he knows perfectly well that the girl is quite strong. However, these are the personal knights of the nobility, and he doesn't think Serere can handle them alone. So she'd better save herself for at least a little while, until this whole situation settles down on its own. He asked her not to drink alcohol late at night for a while and not to go out. But the girl interrupted him without even listening, punching him in the stomach with her fist. She was incredibly angry with the man. He suddenly began to shake with pain and asked why she had even done it, because he really didn't understand. But she turned around and started to walk away, and told him that he was the one who had better be careful, and called him a most genuine idiot. After moving some distance away from him, she turned and asked, "Why are you so uncharacteristically restless all of a sudden?" Waving her hand, she said it was all utter nonsense and she wasn't going to listen to him at all, and told him she had to go now and wished him well too. Lorenzo tried to stop her, but because she hit him really hard in the stomach, he lost his voice for a while, and she went on, humming some tunes, so she didn't even hear him. The girl also managed to take away a small bag of money by some clever maneuvers, and added that as soon as she had a paycheck, she would immediately return everything to him, so he could not worry. Sarah moved away from him at a rather large distance, and scratching the back of her head, she felt incredibly sad, and at the same time she was very angry, because this situation was annoying her insanely. After that, she went straight to the bar. She spent a few hours there and got very drunk so she could hardly walk. And so when Sarah finally did leave the bar, she thought about how incredibly great it was to have thrifty co-workers like hers. The girl walked through the streets, staggering toward home. She hummed to herself some other tune that she liked very much so that she wouldn't be bored. Several men gathered right behind the girl. They followed her, and she didn't even notice anything. She pretended to run into the wall on purpose, while she herself was well aware that there were at least 5 of these people, and at most a dozen. Sarah smiled and immediately took a few steps back and looked around to see that there were far more of them than she had realized. The girl suddenly started smiling and said she had another miscount. In reality, the aristocratic investigation committee called Blood had its main headquarters located in the capital. It is divided into as many as 3 divisions based on the severity of the crimes, but people were only aware of 2. White Squad investigates minor offenses like fraud, theft, and things like that. Blue Division is responsible for criminal cases that are directly related to homicide. And if one such department were to start enemies in the person of the aristocracy, the question arises, which one would be able to do it? The next morning, when the girl returned to her headquarters, she met with the head of the white-blooded department, Campbell. The man looked at her in surprise and asked, was she really asking that he accompany Nuada for the rest of the day? This made him very angry, and he said that they had the same thing going on again, and inquired, who this time? Sarah replied that it was a father who loved his son fervently. Then the man looked into his papers and after checking them, said that they had no plans. The girl smiled as she listened to him, and then asked if he had already spoken to Nod. The man, hearing this, immediately flinched, and looking her straight in the eye, told her that if she mentioned it again, she might not even count on his help anymore. She immediately laughed and asked him not to be so serious, and wondered if maybe that was why Noah had run away. The man sighed heavily, saying that if it weren't for those idiots, this would all be fine. For a while they stood silently looking at each other, but after that the girl turned around. She started to walk away, saying she had to go now. But he stood up from his seat and asked her to stop. The commander wondered if it might be better to ask for protection from the unit. After all, how would she be able to handle it on her own? And Sarah, when she heard this, stood with her back to him for some time, and afterward, turning round, said that in that case she would not meet him again, and asked, was this true? In fact, this all happened before the girl was attempted to be attacked. One of the men in the black hoodie told his partner that she was quite brave. He, pulling out his sword, also added that she herself was going for an alleyway on such a lightless night. He then ran at her to attack her and swung his weapon and said that this was for her for choosing to tussle with the nobility. Now she would know what it was like. The next morning was contentedly peaceful, and in the blue blood department the man sat with a cup of tea pondering all that had happened. Having already drunk several of these mugs, he said that tea should really be enjoyed if you have a spare moment. He also said that because of those idiots who broke into his house last night, he didn't have time to drink it then, so he decided to enjoy it now. However, Noah assumed that it was probably on the orders of the head, so there was nothing he could do about it. At that moment, another man burst into the office, and when he saw him, he was very happy, because he had been looking for him for quite a long time. It was Lorenzo. He came closer to the boy, and when he saw the bundle of paper in his hands, he asked, "Is this a new case from early in the morning?" Thoth immediately asked that the man not be surprised by this much, for he had grand news. Lorenzo inquired if the lad had heard anything about the eldest daughter of the Skal Trading Company. Lorenzo unfolded the papers and said that she had been found dead this morning, but Noad was a little surprised when he heard this, but he didn't really show it. for he had expected something better. In fact, the heiress to the Scarlet Trading Company died right in her bathtub. The newspapers were reporting on Kate Skull's lavish wedding ceremony not too long ago, which had made headlines throughout the empire when suddenly she was found dead in the bathroom. When the man read it, Noah said it was a very serious matter. The newspaper also said that the tragedy was reported by her husband, Norman Lest. And the same Norman Lest was an impoverished aristocrat from a family of high rank, and he possessed a handsome face and excellent manners. He stole quite a large number of women's hearts. For him even attached the title of a womanizer of secular society. And that's why at the wedding, most of the eyes were fixed on him, rather than on the bride herself. However, this was Norman's third wedding in a row, and the two previous wives had also died suddenly. Lorenzo, after telling his teammate about it, also added that eventually a request came in to look at the case, so there's a good chance it will be given to them. Noah, sighing heavily, said he didn't really like all this, since the death of a third wife was no longer considered such an accident. Then suddenly the guy looked around and didn't see the girl, and immediately wondered where she was in the first place. Noah asked Lorenzo in surprise if he didn't know, and added that she hadn't arrived yet, for she could be breaded without being fed just to let her be late. However, the man was really starting to get worried about this incident, because what the commander had told them was absolutely no joke. Noah looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really so worried about her, but advised him to concentrate on more important things, for he was sure there was nothing serious about this case at all, and she would be here soon enough. Lorenzo was about to protest and say something else, but the boy replied that the girl had no money, so she had nowhere to go, so she was safe. Then suddenly the man sighed heavily, put his head down, and said that actually she had the money now. He explained that she had taken a whole bag of coins from him last night, and he hadn't even blinked an eye. Noah, hearing this, even dropped his cup on the ground and asked why he was only talking about it now. He also went to the papers and said that yesterday, after their commander's words, he had made some inquiries about that family. Then he showed him the article and said that the captain of their knightly order had fought in the Civil War and was the most skillful voivode of all. Then he turned to Lorenzo and said in a very worried voice that perhaps something had really happened to her. But the boy had already gotten up from his seat and was running for the exit. He was really beginning to worry about Sarah, for he realized what a temper she had. In his mind, the man asked that she be okay and not hurt in any way because he was really worried about her. At this very time, the girl was in a temporary detention center and was not worried at all, as if she was there every day. Folding her hands behind her head, she leaned them against the wall and suddenly felt a heavy rumble. Then the men burst into the room. She looked at them in surprise and wondered if they were running toward her. She asked if they were really running toward her. Noah, as soon as his breathing returned to normal, began to shout at the girl and asked her if she was in trouble again, if that was why she had been detained and brought to this place. He also said that from now on she would live there, because she was here more often than at home. Lorenzo, who was still having a hard time breathing, said she was just something, but at that moment another man walked in. He turned to Miss Geiss. It was the second white-blooded commander, and his name was Carlson. He brought some papers and said that the results of the investigation were ready. He also added while handing them to her that, just as she thought, they were indeed the Ward Knights of the Frederick family. The girl immediately took the papers in her hands and began to scrutinize them. When the boys heard about all this, they asked in surprise if she had really been attacked, and that was why she was in this place. Carlson replied that everyone was able to be identified and their officers were already on their way to Frederick Manor to punish the perpetrators. Noah poked a finger at the girl at this point and told her not to lie, for surely she was only in this place for fun, for it didn't seem at all from her behavior that she could have been attacked by anyone. Serrer took his hand away from her and asked with a smile on her face that he not exaggerate things so much, and that they calmed down at last. She also said that not every knight is truly strong. In fact, she squeezed the poor fellow's finger so hard that he even cried out in pain. Serrer explained that the men she had to fight at night had completely mediocre sword skills. She also added that out of their superiority, they had only gotten fat. And because of that mass, they could take her if she didn't have all her martial arts abilities. The girl managed quite easily and very quickly to deal with all the warriors, which turned out to be quite a lot, even more than a dozen. To summarize, she also said that it is almost impossible to maintain one's fighting abilities in civilian life. For this one must train daily and preferably not only on dummies. But after that, she got up from her seat and said that since they were all sorted out, she would go home a little early. The girl glowed with happiness and was very proud of herself. Before she left, she approached Lorenzo and thanked him for being so concerned about her. Afterwards, smiling, she asked if they could count her debt as an additional subsidy. The man, on hearing this, was certainly not very pleased, but said nothing in reply. Then Noah intervened in their conversation and asked that the girl stop taking other people's money already, and wondered what it even meant that she was going home, since they hadn't decided everything yet. But at that moment, another man came into the room. It was the head of Campbell. And when he saw Carlson, he was overjoyed, for he was the one he was looking for. Toth handed him the papers, and the man, after studying them, inquired if Sarah had really captured Frederick's knights. Noah had said the matter had taken a very serious turn, so she had no right to go home, for it was very important. When Carlson saw his commander's reaction, he was very surprised and asked if he was completely calm about it and would not react in any way. Boom! Campbell replied that of course he was calm, for Serrer had been working for 10 years on their side, so he did not see what he should be surprised about. When the man heard this, he was really surprised and asked if this meant that she had been practically since the founding of the committee itself. The commander replied that, as he himself already knew, the Blue Blood Division had come to terms with the hatred from the nobles, and Serrer had also changed a lot over time. He also said that he, like Wellers, thought she wasn't human at all, because she was so bloodthirsty that it was hard to believe she had any feelings inside at all. Carlson was surprised and asked if Miss Geiss wasn't an orphan from an impoverished aristocratic family, because that was exactly what he had heard all along. His commander said that certainly, according to the documents, it was indeed true. However, they certainly cannot know for sure, can they? They can't know for sure if she was the real deal, because she could have been evil in the flesh. After all that had happened, it was snowing heavily the next day, and it brought back many memories for the girl. As soon as she walked into the agency, the man who was her partner immediately asked how she was doing. Serrer didn't answer him anything. He wondered if there was anything suspicious about all this. In fact, there was a corpse lying in front of him, covered by a blanket. The girl immediately said she saw nothing strange, and the man asked in surprise what she meant. Serrer wondered if the man's soul had just left her body. The man got angry about all of this and wondered if she couldn't take all of this more seriously, since this was a really important case. The girl immediately laughed because of all this. But what actually lay before them was the body of Kate Skull, who was the sole heiress of their family's trading company. She, as well as her family, were the richest in the empire, and the girl was a very nice woman with a good reputation in society. And Kate Skull, who had absolutely everything, wealth and beauty, suddenly died of unknown causes. And in the end, there wasn't even any evidence left behind, so the man who handled all the dead bodies asked what she thought about it. What really happened there? Serrer, scrutinizing the corpses, afterwards removing her mask, said that her body was very clean. The man also started to take off his mask and looked at her in surprise and asked if maybe she had slipped and just bumped herself somewhere, or if she had been poisoned by something. The girl seriously considered this theory, but then said that if she had slipped, she would have had at least some abrasions on her legs, but they were not there at all. Also, she would instinctively fight for life, which means her lungs would be filled with water. However, as he could see for himself, there was very little water. The man came closer and, after looking at it all, agreed with her, wondering what could really be the cause of death. The girl took off her bloody gloves and said that the lady had probably been thrown into the water when she was already dead. Otherwise, her lungs would certainly have taken on water. So that leaves poisoning on their list. She also said that, just so he knew, she had already sent the mug to toxicology before coming to this place, picked it up from Miss Kate. The man looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really thought ahead. Serer smiled flirtatiously and asked if he had such a bad opinion of her. However, he turned the conversation to another topic and said that with all this, one could conclude that it was indeed a murder that was even well planned. The girl hesitated and wondered if he knew that Norman Lust's ex-wives had also, you see, drowned. She immediately asked if there was evidence for this action. The man became very worried and did not answer her. Serer was actually quite sure that this lady was definitely killed by someone else, she just knew it. But unfortunately, she didn't have the exact proof. She sensed it on some subconscious level, but said nothing to the man and, smiling, replied that in that case she was going to do some digging to get to the truth. Some time had passed since then, and the girl went straight to the shower after examining the corpse. When she washed her head, she looked at herself in the reflection of the tiles, which were perfectly clean. Serer noticed her red hair and realized it was the same color as that dead girl's. As she continued to rinse the foam off them, she suddenly felt very bad about the whole thing. But at that moment, the door to the bathroom suddenly opened. Lorenzo came in there and told the girl that the corpse had already been examined and some conclusions had been drawn. However, as soon as he took a closer look, he suddenly saw the girl completely naked. He immediately cried out in fear and turned away so that he wouldn't see it. He said that of course he understood that it was a shared bathroom and so on. However, he asked if she could bathe in a less conspicuous place in the future. Serer, continuing to wash the foam off her body, said that she was actually the one who needed to scream, and asked why he was suddenly so freaked out that he was screaming almost for the entire building. She also added that even if right at that moment she doesn't see him, she can still kick him, so he better not get close for sure. The man began to walk over to a nearby shower room, continuing to cover his face with his hands so he wouldn't see all of the woman's assets. He said he would just wash his feet and leave right away. When he got to the shower, he poured water all over himself, because he had not switched to the lower faucet. When the girl heard him screaming because his entire face was now wet, she immediately laughed. After she calmed down a bit, she continued to wash and wondered about this suspect they were all still looking for. The man rolled up the pants on his legs and started washing all the dirt off his feet and said it was no big deal. He kept not looking in her direction. He explained that the one was more like a husband who is in despair after losing his wife, for as soon as Lorenzo came, he was immediately even glad to see him. The man got straight to the point and asked how he met his wife. Their suspect responded that their acquaintance was as an investor and entrepreneur. When he was silent, Lorenzo said that he had heard a great deal about how almost everyone did not want this marriage. So he wondered how a man had managed to take her as his wife. Norman said they took a very long time to talk them into it. To his father-in-law, he is still incredibly grateful. The man, hearing this, was very surprised. He didn't think that he would be able to persuade such a stubborn man so easily, who said that he didn't need a useless guy and was skeptical about his daughter's choice all the time. Norman, rubbing his hands, which were shaking, said he was incredibly happy. To him, this woman was something he certainly didn't deserve. The man said that he was a man who had lost his wife twice, and Kate had been a real comfort to him. When he said this phrase, tears came to his eyes, and he said that it was not his fault. He just hoped that he could find happiness. Then Norman was completely unable to contain his emotions and cried right in front of Lorenzo, completely unashamed. At that moment, the man who had recounted everything to her wanted to say something about it. But Serer interrupted him and asked him if he felt anything. He immediately stopped talking and looked around in surprise, not sure what she meant. The girl said that she was sure she had just heard something strange. He suddenly felt quite uncomfortable. He asked what she was talking about, But the girl screamed as if possessed and said she was sure she had heard something. Soon after she finished bathing and dressed, she returned to her office where Lorenzo and Naud were already sitting there. And she shouted happily and said that she had known it would be a binge. Lorenzo, for his part, got very angry and said that they were still investigating. If she drinks, it will obviously not be a good decision. Naud, who at that moment was lying on the couch sleeping, was immediately awakened by these cries and asked when they had come at all, for he had not noticed them until that moment. A sailor, taking the can of booze, said with a smile on her face that this was a situation where the dead couldn't say anything else, and Kate certainly wasn't living from them having a few drinks, so she didn't see it as a problem at all. Of course, Lorenzo did not like this at all, however. He could not go against his superior. 4 years and 7 months before the end of the 30 Years' Civil War, blonde Joan of Arc won the Great Battle of Orleans. During the successive defeats of the Royalists and Lord Seals, the sudden appearance of Joan of Arc changed the course of history for the next full 10 years. Historians identified her as a secret crony of the emperor and considered her story an unsolved mystery. At that moment, the story was being told on TV, and Lorenzo wondered why nothing had come out about the nobles. And his friend replied that he believes that the series Adolf will definitely not be boring, and blonde Joan of Arc will never lose its popularity. Naud also said that loyalist and current leader of the military aristocracy, Adolf Chyolov, he has heard many times that he's already tired of it. The girl walked over to the television and, turning it off, said that all of this was true. However, Joan of Arc and Adolphus are both murderers, so Lorenzo did not understand why they could be praised. See, at this point, when Naud saw that the girl was about to turn off the television, he immediately asked that she not do so. But she explained that it was the wrong program for a pacifist like her to watch. At that moment, Lorenzo immediately blushed a little and started smiling. Watching her actions, the man got very angry and asked why he was suddenly so happy, because she was just a thuggish pacifist who wouldn't even let them watch an entertainment program. But he didn't say anything. In the end, several hours later, it was getting dark outside, and they continued to drink. Naud, because he was very susceptible to alcohol, fell asleep rather quickly because he had drunk so much. Sarah, while getting another can of alcohol, saw the concerned look on the man's face and, smiling, told him not to worry so much. She explained that he had been concerned ever since he had met Norman. She also added that there was a possibility of poisoning, because one way or another, all the evidence would be scrutinized. However, the man still wasn't very cheered up by this, and he sat very sadly for a while, pondering whether to tell the girl one thing. But then he gathered his thoughts and turned to her and asked what would happen then if Norman really was innocent. How would they be able to find the real murderer if they didn't have any leads? Seeing her surprised look on his face, he immediately said that he meant that maybe it wasn't by his will. He was suddenly even more shy. In fact, alcohol makes him more talkative, so he said maybe this time it would be different. Lorenzo explained that the man did look like someone who was grieving the death of a loved one, so there may have been some special circumstances. After the man said all this, there was an awkward silence between them. It was almost midnight on the clock. Naud was sleeping peacefully on the sofa. After a while, the girl finally spoke up and asked that he stop even thinking such nonsense. Looking her partner straight in the face, she asked, "Does he really think that all his wives died of their own accord?" Then the man, angry, immediately said that this was not the case at all. Sarah continued to insist and asked if Norman Lest might have been forced to resort to murder. But did the dead deserve such an unenviable fate? The man became quite uncomfortable. He turned away from her and said nothing. He was silent for a while and then, rising from his seat, said that, not at all. He believed that, being in a drunken state, he had simply made a mistake. After that, heading for the exit, said it was too late, so they better go to bed, as they would have a hard day tomorrow. He walked around the building for a while, then went back into the office. By then, the girl was tired too and had fallen asleep. Lorenzo covered her with a blanket to keep her warm, for the night was already getting cold. When he did, The girl immediately woke up and, looking at the back of his head, said that with such excessive softness on this job, he would definitely not last long. She also added that it was very hard for her to understand why he was suddenly sympathizing with Norman. However, she was afraid that it might even backfire on himself. Serrer explained that this could happen because the loser's fate was his alone, so the man should be careful with his feelings. Lorenzo said nothing. Lyosha said goodnight to her, and for a long time he could not sleep because of the various thoughts going through his head. When the next morning came, the janitors who worked outside their building immediately began to clean up the streets, for they get dirty pretty quickly overnight. Serrer, as soon as she woke up, went straight to the medical examiner, who went by the name of Walter, and asked how such a thing was even possible. The man said it was as if she had risen from the grave and looked disgusting, and asked if she had really been drinking all night. The girl sighed heavily and said that if that were really the case, that would be fine. However, it was just her blood pressure spoiling, dropping lower than it needed to again. Walter, upon hearing this, was even a little upset and said that he was sorry for her in such a case, and added that unfortunately he had never discovered anything. He also added that, except it had cost him a year's salary, the girl was very angry about it, for she was still feeling pretty bad. The girl immediately asked the doctor if he had not made a mistake by accident, for perhaps the substance was colorless and odorless. The man, on hearing this, was very surprised and said that of course this was impossible, for death was due to cerebral vasospasm. In simple terms, it's a spasm of a cerebral artery, and that would be the official cause of her death. The girl immediately began to protest and said that there could be no such thing, for it was a case of murder. Walter looked at her with irritation and immediately inquired, in her opinion, how the girl had been killed. Serrer panicked a little, for of course she didn't have a complete theory yet, but she still insisted and asked that the man check again, for she couldn't leave something like this without due consideration. She also wondered if she should stay with him until the results came back, but Walter certainly wasn't prepared to tolerate such a thing, so he told her to leave. At this very time, Lorenzo was sitting in his office sorting out some papers to send off for inspection. But then suddenly, when a man came into his office and was surprised to see him, he immediately inquired why he was sitting in the office and not with his boss. This man turned out to be the head of Villars, and when the lad saw him, he replied at once that he wanted to study Norman Lest's file more closely, and that was why he had stayed. The man waved his hand and said he understood, and added that this death would probably be registered as an accident, so there was nothing to worry about. Lorenzo, hearing this, immediately rose from his seat and, coming closer to the commander, asked what he was talking about in the first place. The man sat down on the sofa and replied that he received a call from the headquarters in the capital and was told to just close the case because the investigation was still standing, so it was not worth wasting energy and time on all this. The man was, of course, very upset when he heard this, for he was really madly anxious to look into the matter more closely. Well, then the commander, smiling, said that he had worked so painstakingly, so he was madly sorry it had happened like this. Lorenzo, smiling, said he shouldn't. After all, he really should have expected such an outcome, so it was okay. When the commander took a closer look at him, he immediately told him to go and wash up quickly, for his appearance was clearly not good. This made the man a little uncomfortable, but he immediately went to fulfill his order. As soon as the man opened the water and began to wash his face, he thought about that order from headquarters. It made him very wary. He didn't understand how one could so easily give up murder and make it just an accident, and also how one could just leave a case that was rather convoluted and could be very serious like that. At this point, his commander continued to sit in the room and remembered the time he had just been told he had to leave the case. Though, of course, he was then very surprised and asked the commander if he knew who the victim's family even was, because this girl was from the Rocks, who had their own trading company, and that was very important. But the man, with a heavy sigh, replied that everyone knew that. The man then continued to insist on his point, and inquired if he represented any aristocrats who bowed to their kind, so they couldn't just drop everything like that. But the commander turned to Villars and said that somehow or other a special order had come, and they certainly could not refuse or deny it in any way. Also, before he left, he said that how the man would relay the information to his team was completely none of his business, but he should enjoy the end of the year properly, because no one knows what will happen next. Of course, Villars didn't like all this, for this case was, shall we say, his last hope for a good reputation, for things hadn't been very good lately. But at that moment, some rustling began to be heard behind the papers. As the man turned his head to the side, he thought to himself that it must be Sarah. However, at that moment, a black-haired man appeared behind the papers and said that apparently they had another fight with Lorenzo, and he needed to intervene. When their commander saw the drunken Node, who had just woken up, he was very surprised and asked, since when had he even been in this place? He had really frightened him, hadn't he? The man, seeing the commander, replied that he had been lying there for quite some time, then handed him the paper and asked him to look at it carefully. The commander was a little surprised when the man started to hand him the paper, but he took it nonetheless. Noah replied that all the inheritance Norman had received from his ex-wives was simply gone. Villars, upon hearing this, was immediately interested and asked, "Is this really accurate information that cannot be refuted?" Noah replied that this is indeed true. A ruined nobleman who is out of touch with politics as well, which is exactly what Norman is. He also said that someone even higher up is clearly behind him. The case is very bad, because it's incredibly confusing, and he just doesn't know how to find the truth. The commander immediately thought about it and said that if indeed everything he had been told was true, then he would personally take the case. But no sooner had he finished the last sentence than suddenly Lorenzo came running into the room. He had the girl in his arms, and he said at once that they had had a great misfortune. As soon as the commander turned around and saw Serrer in his arms, who was all wet, he immediately asked what had happened, as well as what was wrong with her. Lorenzo immediately shouted and said she was dead, and when the other two men heard this, they could not contain their astonishment and asked how such a thing was even possible. In fact, it all happened too quickly. Lorenzo stood washing his face in his bathroom as he continued to think about the situation that had occurred. He still did not understand why everybody was covering for Norman. Accordingly, he supposed that perhaps the man was also somehow involved in the affair. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he realized that washing his face alone was definitely not enough to make him look more or less normal. He decided that the best way for him to do that would be to dip his head in cold water. Then he would certainly perk up and look better. However, as soon as he stepped into the bathroom, his pupils immediately dilated with surprise. He saw that Serrer was bathing there again, and as soon as he saw her bare shoulders, he immediately turned around and started yelling loudly at her, for he hadn't expected to see her. The girl was a little surprised. She immediately looked at the man and wondered why it was that he was screaming like that again. The man turned all red again, and continuing to yell, said that he had already asked her to be more careful when she used the bathroom and to make some identification on the doors. The girl, indignant, said that she had actually done so. She had left all her clothes outside. The man indignantly asked where she was lying, and the girl replied that she had undressed right in front of the entrance. Then he ran up to her and, looking straight into her eyes, asked how he could have known it was even her. After all, everyone's uniform was the same. Serrer ignored his remarks and wondered if he wanted to bathe together. After all, he could even rub her back. Lorenzo sighed heavily and said that she seemed to be in a rather bad mood, and the smile immediately fell from the girl's face. Then he inquired if she had already met Dr. Burby. As soon as the girl heard these words, she immediately poured a few drops of water on his face. Afterward, with a smile on her face, she wondered if he really thought she looked like the kind of person whose mood would fall because of little things like that. She also said that if the doctor says it's not poison, then it's really true. She's just thinking of other ways it could have happened. The man looked at her and said that he had been informed that the case had been closed as an accident. Such an order had come straight from headquarters to their commander. As soon as she heard this, she was very surprised. So for a while the girl was silent, trying to process this information in her head. But then she pretended as if nothing had happened, and inquired whether Lorenzo was glad of such a thing, for he himself had asserted that Norman was not a criminal. The man asked, indignantly, when he had ever said such a thing. He felt a little embarrassed. So he turned away from the girl again and said that it just seemed to him that the guy wasn't really mourning the death of his wife. That's why he couldn't believe the theory that a man could have killed her. Sarah turned to him again and asked if he remembered last year's case, the situation of the Baroness who had killed her eldest son so that her youngest would succeed her. After a moment's thought, Lorenzo said that he remembered perfectly well. Then the girl went on and said that he had said then that the mother could not have killed her child, had asserted it with unbelievably great certainty. In the end, however, it turned out that she was the culprit. It was the Baroness who killed her one child so that another could become ruler. In such cases, of course, the first suspicion is the loved ones, and Lorenzo knew it well, because no matter how close they were to each other, still greed takes its toll. Serrer said that, in addition, it is almost always the relatives who are to blame. Most murders are committed by prime suspects who have failed to restrain their own desires. Other times, however, the closer the relationship, the bigger the appetites become. Then she stood up and wondered what would happen if we took their case, for example. Lorenzo said he was really incredibly suspicious because there's almost no evidence, and there's only one suspect, and that one acts like he didn't do anything. Pensive, the girl splashed water at him again and said that she found it very funny that she had to explain this to a man with 3 years' experience. She had thought that when you had been working so long it was obvious. She also continued to badmouth him again and asked him where her tuition was then and wanted him to write off her debt. Lorenzo was quite wet by then, and with his head down he asked his boss to stop already, for he wouldn't be able to stand it much longer like this. Sarah immediately laughed and said that she was wondering what their evil boy would do in such a case. After these words, she splashed him with water again. Then the man, angry and leaning over her face, said that he was not the one who had started it, but apparently he had to finish it. Serrer, of course, took his words as a joke and, laughing, asked that he try it after all. After the man brought the girl's dead body into the office, the supervisor and his assistant tried to come up with a solution as to what to do now. For a while, they didn't realize if it was even true. And then, when the man told the whole story, Naod told his friend that he must have succeeded in finishing her off. But Lorenzo, protesting, replied that it was a game and nothing more. She doused him with water without end, but he also doused her a little in revenge. Naod, hearing this, was very surprised and asked how he could even do that. At the same moment, their supervisor started resuscitating the girl, giving her indirect cardiac massage. After a while, some water came out of her mouth, and he interrupted the men's conversation by saying that she was finally breathing. The guys, when they heard this, got very excited and immediately ran up to the girl. When they saw her breasts rising and falling as she inhaled and exhaled, they were relieved. When everything was back to normal, Naod grabbed his friend by the hair and called him the ultimate idiot. He didn't understand how the guy could even do such a thing. He continued to swear at Lorenzo and said that no matter how much his girlfriend provoked him, drowning a coworker was the ultimate ruinous and low thing to do. Lorenzo, at this point, already had a big bruise on his head, and he wondered how he could have known that it would turn out like this. He thought it was a simple game, so he didn't think that it could end up with such serious consequences. He explained that he'd merely grabbed her leg then, but he wasn't the one who'd started it all anyway. The moment he lifted her leg up, her whole body plunged fully into the tub. When it all happened, Lorenzo himself was surprised. He immediately began shouting her name, and afterwards he dipped into the water and retrieved her. Naod, hearing his excuse, wondered in surprise if he really believed her, if he thought she could go quiet just like that. In his defense, however, Lorenzo said that she was the first to start the incitement and knew perfectly well that it was a joke, so he partially does not see his guilt in the whole situation. The guy started yelling and cursing at him even more, saying that you have to realize what you can joke with and what you can't joke with, and life is exactly the point that you can't joke with under any circumstances. He asked Lorenzo and thought to himself, if a person were to be dunked in water like that, surely they would not be okay. They would begin to drown. Also, Naod said that just splashing water and dunking a person whole with their head are completely different things, so he thinks his friend is completely wrong in this situation. When Lorenzo heard this, he was very surprised and thoughtful. He wondered if they meant to say that she had drowned, but had not even pretended to drown. Sarah actually realized when she was underwater then that he had caught her off guard, and it annoyed her. The girl knew perfectly well that she had fainted. However, Lorenzo was very annoyed with her for doing so. The girl realized that she couldn't just lose consciousness like that, because otherwise everything would be bad. While she was in the water, some dead people started to appear behind her, accusing her of something. She didn't hear them for a while, but soon the voices grew louder. They were not calling her a hero, but a devil in the flesh. Of course, she was already unresponsive and was really hoping to be woken up as soon as possible. She saw a glimmer of light at the top of the water. Sarah mentally pleaded to be woken up as soon as possible, but soon she finally lost consciousness. After that, the girl began to hear someone calling her. It was a blonde-haired man who called her Mistress Jean. When she opened her eyes, she saw him in front of her. He moved closer to her and told her that she had stopped talking so abruptly and that it had made him very frightened. He also inquired what she had meant by her past words. When Jean heard this, she looked at the man in surprise. She knew his name to her surprise. It was Schwartz. But then suddenly other knights began to run up to her, saying that the lady had finally arrived with a victory. Everyone around them was jumping and cheering. The man said that it was certainly a massive spectacle, but he still wanted to hear an explanation from her. Jean then took off her helmet, revealing bright yellow hair underneath. She said there was nothing in it, and also wondered if they had won again. The man looked at the color of her hair with an enchanted gaze and said, smiling, that it was all thanks to Mistress Jean alone. They had defeated their enemies again with her help. She, smiling, said that it was indeed so. Then she raised her sword up and, addressing all the inhabitants, said that they had indeed won, and the girl was very proud. In fact, the girl saw all these memories in front of her, namely the memories of Jean, the war heroine, or as everyone called her, the golden-haired Joan of Arc. They were memories of that puppet show, but they were all too real. Oh, in fact, each title also has its own history, and once Sarah became a warrior, she had to know and remember it always. She was told all the time that if she didn't kill first, she would be killed in return, and there was nothing more she could do. So the girl had to know everything. After she was in her memories, she traveled with a man through the forest after her victory. Jean looked around and sighed heavily, saying that there were a lot of crows, and that made her very nervous. Another sparrow flew right above them again, and looking at it, the girl asked why they were flying so much in that part of the forest. The man looked at her and said in a mysterious voice that they knew they were in for a treat soon. He rode a little behind his wife Dark and said that the war should be about to end and things would soon be all right. Soon as they began to approach the town, one could see a large number of people who were in dirty clothes and very tired. Some were even unconscious. As soon as they had gone on, the car turned to Mrs. Jean and told her not to jump to conclusions, for they had only captured the castle. He also wondered if she thought these people would defend themselves, and asked the mistress to relax, for he thought they must be too tired after everything. But Jean stopped him and pointed somewhere toward the woods, wondering what the soldiers were doing there. And it was indeed true. Some soldiers were on the mountain with shovels and digging some holes and carrying heavy sacks. The man explained that they were following orders. In fact, at that moment, the soldiers were putting people to sleep. Although the men were still alive, they were being buried. And the man said that His Majesty had ordered the prisoners to be buried. Jean looked at him in surprise and wondered if they would all just be taken and buried alive. It was hard for her to imagine such a thing. But the fellow replied that everything was perfectly correct, for they were trying to poison His Majesty so they would be punished properly. He also explained that if the press found out about it, it would be very hard, which is why soldiers do it. After hearing all this, Jean went to the king's tent, which was nearby, to find out what was even going on and how such a thing was possible. And as soon as she stepped inside, she immediately saw the very Emperor Frederick III sitting at a table and discussing some very important topic with an aide. But as soon as he heard the girl's screams, he immediately turned in her direction and gave her a surprised look. As soon as Adolphe Keola, who was the leader of the nobility, saw Jeanne, he immediately inquired who allowed her to enter the emperor's tent without permission at all. The girl immediately bowed and apologized, but Friedrich waved his hand toward the assistant and told him to be quiet, for he was overreacting to everything. In fact, the emperor did not look his best and freshest. However, smiling, he said that the girl was after all a universal hero who had become very famous. He also said it was the same golden-haired Joan of Arc, and inquired, "Does such a man need any permission to enter the barracks?" Rising from his seat, he replied that apparently the lady had come on business, so he would leave. Adolphus bowed and immediately thanked His Highness for this, and said that they would settle things rather quickly. But the moment the emperor started to pass by the girl, he asked the man to remember to carry out the order, and after that, he left. When he closed the door, Adolphe immediately inquired if she had come at all. Jean replied that she had seen something very curious and strange. The man, without taking his eyes off some papers he held in his hands, immediately inquired what it was. She immediately said that apparently the soldiers had nothing better to do now that they had moved to dig a huge hole in the hill and to wall people up alive in it. Adolphe, hearing this, did not react or even say anything. Then the girl could not stand it and began to shout loudly at him, asking him if he had lost his mind. How could he just agree to such an order? She also asked, "What about the most basic respect for the military? After all, they've been through a lot already." Adolphe said in a completely calm voice. The girl just looked at it a little differently than they did. So he also asked that she bring her men, and after all they should finish as soon as possible, and preferably even on the same day. He added that they should leave the place as soon as possible, for His Majesty had ordered them not to mess around for long. Jean looked at him in surprise and asked how on earth he could take as emperor someone who gave such inhuman orders without thinking of anyone else at all. But afterward she suddenly wondered if he himself might wish to become a ruler, to act as he pleased. The man, upon hearing this suggestion, immediately looked at her and asked her to take a good look at what she was saying. And that's because any disrespect will be dealt with according to military law. So she better watch what she says and to whom she says it. After he said that, he added that she could go now that she had told him everything. Jeanne, of course, was angry about all this, for she had scenes of poor people being buried alive right before her eyes. They were all crying and screaming. Someone even mentally grabbed her hand and asked her to save at least the child, for he was not guilty of anything at all. She even asked that her child become at least a slave, so that he would not die like that, because he had never even seen life. Shortly thereafter, the girl went outside and was met there by her partner, who immediately ran up to her and asked if she was okay at all. But then suddenly, the emperor came up to them and said that this child had died. The girl wondered in surprise, what is he talking about? She had thought that this vision was only in her head, but it had actually happened in real life. After that, he asked Jean to stay in the barracks for a while, for she did not like that sort of thing at all. The three of them and a few soldiers stood near the pit where people were buried alive. Schwartz had already agreed with him and wanted to take the girl under his arm to lead her away. However, she punched him directly in the stomach. Jean asked that he not talk nonsense, for she is a soldier who went to war before he did. She took the shovel in her hands and also said that she was the one called Saint on the battlefield, so they had no right to doubt her. After that, she went on her way. Schwartz immediately ran after her and tried to stop her, while the emperor behind her kept shouting for her to follow his orders. But the girl didn't care at all. She didn't want to listen to anyone. Adolphe had already come out to them at this point, but the assistant who was holding the papers came up to him and asked him if he could step back with him for a moment. The man, of course, said he could, and thereupon the assistant handed him the papers, replying that he had found the geologic book of the Camillus family at this place. At this very time, the emperor was incredibly angry at those people who had already been buried. He would stomp on the ground and talk about how they had all died, and it was for absolutely no reason at all. However, something strange happened at that moment, and when Jean heard it, she immediately turned to the side to check what it was. It was the emperor who continued to shout, but he was already angry and shouted at some guy who grabbed him and put a knife straight to his throat. He asked how the man had dared to do such a thing. However, the man turned to the other soldiers and told them to stay back if they didn't want to see him die. No doubt, his hand was trembling because of fear, and the knife kept coming closer and closer to the emperor's throat. He said that if they took one more step toward him, his head would just fall off and roll on the ground. So they better listen to him. Yes, herself, maybe dressed that very war heroine, the golden-haired Joan of Arc, sided with the emperor and led him to victory. Historians have concluded that she gave up all riches and honors, having simply disappeared without a trace after all that had happened. According to rumors, which were very common back then, the hunt was over, and so the king decided to eliminate it, like an old flaming dog that no one wanted anymore. Thus, she suddenly disappeared without leaving even a single clue. And what happened to her people turned her existence into a mere legend, you see, not seen in a long time. The man who was standing next to the emperor continued to shout and threaten him, but this turn of events was not expected even by Jean herself, who has a very good intuition and reaction. The emperor himself suddenly shouted, addressing all the soldiers who were slowly coming closer and closer. He told them all to move back at least one step. The man wanted to resist and somehow remove this bully, but the emperor insisted on his own and told them to move away. Otherwise, this psychopath will really just kill him. Then the fair-haired man spoke in a quiet voice, addressing Frederick, and told him to listen carefully and repeat. He said it was all crazy and asked that he order all the soldiers to stop right then, but the emperor was silent. Jeanne d'Arc looked at all this in surprise and did not understand how it was possible. And the man continued to insist on his own and asked that he quickly say it already. The girl turned to Schwartz and asked him to wait for a while and began to go into the thick of things. The soldiers were surprised to see her pass and did not even delay her. Then the blonde-haired man pointed his burden at her when he saw her approaching them and asked why she had suddenly gone, for he had told everyone to stay in their seats. Jean completely ignored his words and continued to walk forward, all because Schwartz was behind her with his crossbow and was ensuring her. The man started to panic even more, kept shouting at her and said that she didn't care about the emperor's death. At this point, the guy had an arrow ready to pierce the man's head. Jean spoke to him and told him that his persistence and courage in getting out of a deep hole was very precious to her, and she was really surprised that he had found the will to do so. At the moment when she and her weapon had already gotten very close, the guy was about to pierce the emperor's throat when suddenly an arrow shot out and flew straight at him. Frederick immediately began to fall. Then Jean ran up to His Highness and managed to catch him, asking if he was all right. At that moment, the emperor started shouting and cursing loudly. He asked how this idiot, who didn't even have milk on his lips yet, dared to take him hostage and threaten him. Jean tried to calm him down and told him that he was a prisoner, and his fate was death anyway, so he shouldn't worry too much. In fact, the emperor's throat was cut a little because he had twitched so much. She also asked that he not waste all his energies in vain on this man, for his fate would surely catch up with him yet. But soon the emperor couldn't stand it any longer, broke free from the girl's hands and immediately ran up to the guy who had grabbed him. He took him by his clothes and asked him how he even dared to do such a thing, for he really didn't understand how anyone could do such a thing. The man kept screaming and said that it was probably those idiots who sent him. They had just decided to kill him, so they did such a nasty thing. Joan of Arc stood back and just watched the whole thing. She knew perfectly well that the emperor was suffering from a mental illness, and that was why he was behaving like this. In fact, the genetic disease of the imperial family was a rather secretive phenomenon. No one talked about such a thing because then it would undermine their authority. The ruler became a puppet in the hands of the aristocrats. He's been crazy ever since. Frederick's symptoms of illness began to manifest themselves with even greater vigor, and he ceased even to control himself. After thinking about it, the girl turned to Schwartz and asked him to bring a military doctor immediately, because the emperor really needed urgent help so that he would not do more stupid things. The boy said he would do anything. Then the girl began to come closer to His Majesty and asked him to calm down, for his serious wound might open up even more, and then it would be very bad. Frederick wasn't going to settle down, though. He threw the guy who had taken him hostage to the side and said that he should be burned alive. He threw the fellow back into the pit, and the girl, hearing his orders, immediately asked him what he was saying, for she thought she had just heard him. There were still a few people in the pit, however. Many of them had fainted from what had happened, but the emperor continued to insist. He looked the girl straight in the eye and said he wanted them all burned without exception. Jean was incredibly surprised. She asked what it was he was even saying and also why he wanted it, but the emperor ignored her words. He turned to the soldiers and asked them to pour oil into each pit and burn all these people alive. He was not interested in their emotional state afterward. He went to the barrels that contained the special oil, took one of them, and began to open it. The girl insisted and said that even if they were prisoners, they could not be executed in such a way. She said that this was not an execution at all, but a real genocide, and it was absolutely wrong to do that. She was strongly opposed to such actions. The girl kept screaming and begging him to finally stop, for it was wrong to do so, but the emperor ignored her and would not listen at all. When she turned her head to the side, she saw that one of the soldiers began to pour oil inside, and then he set fire to the pit, and the people began to scream loudly in pain, for the fire was burning them completely. Jean just stood there staring for a while. She couldn't believe that he had actually done that. When she came to her senses a little, she ran after the emperor and said that the war was not over yet, and if anyone found out about such a brutal and cruel killing of prisoners, they would definitely not be able to avoid trouble. Frederick ignored her words. The girl went on and said that no one would lay down their arms in the next battle, and they would end up suffering very heavy losses that were certainly not worth it. Then the man finally spoke. He turned to Mrs. Jean and, pulling out his weapon, said that he did not need a talking sword. It was of no use at all. After that, he threw away his weapon and asked her to go and get more torches, for that one had gone out rather quickly and not all the people had been burned. When another torch was finally brought to the emperor, he looked at the prisoner who had taken him hostage and said that he would never get out. The man had the look of a most genuine madman who was ready to go even to such a thing, and no one doubted now that he really had some disorders. After that, the emperor lowered the torch straight into the pit, where people were doused with special oil, and Joan of Arc just stood there and watched it all happen. For the sake of such a scene, she had to fight. She could have died, and in the end she got just such a result. The killer and the hero are actually quite a bit different from each other, and all because the hero has to kill in order to get any results. Jean watched those poor people being burned alive. Some of them couldn't even move because they were too weak. But at that moment, the prisoner who had grabbed the emperor began to crawl out. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, and he looked straight at the girl. And Emperor Frederick himself just stood by the cliff and, watching all this fire, laughed out loud, happy at what he had done. In fact, if one has become a murderer, the title of hero can be thrown away for sure. And at that moment, Joan of Arc pounced on the emperor and did what she had to do, for he had another torch in his hand. Soon afterward, Adolf called her to him and beat her very much in the face, for he was just furious about what had happened. The man hit her harder each time and asked her why she did it. The girl didn't answer him for a while, but soon she finally spoke. She said that as far as the reason was concerned, She originally only wanted to destroy the torch. Then Adolphus also said that the blood must have made her completely insane. The girl, however, continued her story and, smiling, replied that the emperor had a very beautiful jeweled ring with a lovely stone on his thumb. She thought about its value and slightly mistook the blow she had made. At that moment, Adolf swung at her again, and she didn't even avert her gaze, looking him straight in the eye. Actually, taking away the torch didn't mean rescinding the emperor's order. She had to channel this madness in a completely different direction. A launched arrow can't be stopped, so it's easier to just change the target, and then it will work out. Adolf didn't hit her after all. He sat down on the couch, head down, asking how they could fix this situation now. Jeanne, whose face was all red from the endless beatings, asked what he was even talking about. The man, getting even more angry, slammed his fist against the sofa, thus shattering its handle, and asked, "Did she really think she could get away with such a prank?" She just went ahead and chopped off the emperor's hand. As she continued to smile, she wondered if she had any other options besides death, since she certainly wouldn't be forgiven so easily for such a prank. The man's hand even began to tremble at this point from all his emotions. He said that he had absolutely not taught her to die so easily, but she replied that what she had done was, alas, not to be taken back, so she had nothing else to do. She also said that she hoped His Excellency would feel at least a little regret about it, because she had failed to become the hero he desperately wanted her to be. When Jean said this, she immediately laughed loudly and replied that Saint's play was over, and she saw no need to call him respectfully anymore. Adolf sat with his head down, and she called him her father, for that was what he was. And the man looked up at her when he heard this. He was incredibly furious about everything that had happened. In fact, when she was younger, the man himself had taught her martial arts, and when she had killed one of the soldiers, Adolf had sighed heavily and said that she had once again failed to finish him off with a single blow. He also said that in the actual battle, she literally presented him with her neck on a platter, so she should be even more careful and attentive. They practiced day and night in absolutely all kinds of weather. Adolf made his daughter run even in a heavy downpour and yelled at her the whole time. The girl had to train incredibly hard in order to finally please her father, and when she had killed a few more people, he said that she was finally starting to have some real skills and that she would be able to join the war effort pretty quickly, since they could use the extra hands there. After these words, the man took the hair dye and said that from now on she was not his daughter, but would be the golden-haired Jeanne d'Arc that mankind would remember. He also said that if she wanted to survive, she would definitely have to become a hero who could save people and be remembered in their minds. And now that the girl had cut off the emperor's hand, she stood before her father and said, smiling, that the hero he had been raised to be had ended up being a murderer. And so she thought it must be very unpleasant for him to realize that. Jean talked about how he really had nothing to worry about because his status was absolutely completely safe. And all because beheaded for treason, Jeanne d'Arc will be a completely different person. No one could ever think the idea that she is his daughter. The man was silent for a while. Then he finally got up from his seat and said that there was a town in the north called Kinkala, and there was a branch of the bloodline there. By placing an agency to monitor the nobles in the north, they are trying to improve the horrible security system. In fact, this place is very little different from an exile for aristocrats who have left office. At this point, he lit a cigarette and, tossing the lighter to her, said that she should live there for 10 years as if she were asleep, and that there would be no word from her, by the way. He said she was a missing person now, nothing more. She needed to act like it, and in turn, he too would become him, as grave as if she didn't exist at all. Anna looked at her father in surprise and said she didn't understand anything at all, why he was doing this and how it would help her. Adolf said that as soon as the emperor wakes up, he will immediately order her soul to be destroyed, so she should leave right away while she is still in the form of Jeanne. The man also said that this would be his last order. Soon the girl recolored her hair and really went to the place he had directed her to. Before Jean went to self-organization, she was a bit frustrated because she has no time to even think about her future. She has to be on the move all the time. Well, the day went on, it snowed, and she went inside. I met her there right away, Commander, and asked her if she really wanted to apply to them. Jean looked at him in surprise and wondered, is there really a problem with that? But the man replied that there was no problem. It was just the first time he had seen a man who had come to the place of his own free will and insisted on being taken in. He walked over to the paper on the table and asked that she fill them out, because he needed personal information for the documents. The girl immediately wrote it down, and the man suddenly inquired, was she from the army? Jean looked at him in surprise, asking how he had even guessed. The man explained that the lighter was made at the Sirenica factory, and they are only delivered to military personnel on the battlefield, and they're only used by the highest levels of government. When the girl didn't answer anything, he said, smiling, that they were not interested in her status or her past. So she didn't have to worry and didn't have to say anything at all. After a while, Jean finally filled everything out and handed the man the paper, saying that everything was ready. The man, after studying them, said that everything was correct, and also added that in that case he was glad to welcome her to the Blue Blood. Just as her father had said, she had invented a new identity for herself and was now Sarah. A long time had passed since then, and the girl finally, after being nearly drowned by Lawrence, had awakened. The guy, seeing that she finally did open her eyes, was immediately overjoyed, and other men ran up to her as well. Naud ran up close to her and immediately started pointing his fingers in front of her face and asking her what number she could see to check if she was definitely okay. The girl looked at him in surprise. Then Lawrence sighed heavily and replied that she had no idea how much they were all worried. He also added that he actually thought for a while that she was dead. But no sooner had he finished the sentence than Serer took and hit him with all her might right on the cheek. After that, she got up and started to leave, saying that luckily it was already over, so they definitely didn't need to worry anymore. Serer walked on, remembering her father's words to make it as if she had never existed. In fact, she had forgotten about it, but after the near-death experience, she remembered immediately. She, smiling, told everyone present that she had just been reminded of a completely useless memory, so everything was definitely fine now. Naud, hearing this, immediately looked at her in surprise and asked, was she really being chased by a collector in her dream? The girl was even a little annoyed by this assumption and said it was nonsense, and wondered how long she had been unconscious in the first place. The guy immediately replied that she hadn't been with them for about half a day, so they even thought she had straight up died. He couldn't understand why she was so irritated when she had just woken up and was already screaming and even kicking. Sarah, hearing how long she had been unconscious, became very angry, for this was madness, and it was because she was going to have her judgment day very soon. Naud, upon hearing this, immediately remembered that he had forgotten to tell her something, so he turned to the girl and said that he had found some evidence. From that moment some time passed, and the girl formed an ingenious plan, which she just realized in reality. It was past mid-afternoon, and poor Lorenzo was carrying a huge tub into their work building, while the girl stood by herself and enjoyed the beautiful weather. Serer even hummed a tune, and when the man suddenly stopped to catch his breath a bit, she asked indignantly what he was standing there for. After all, we should hurry up. He immediately thought about going into the setting and asking the builders. Then it would definitely be very normal, and he wouldn't have to carry so much. Sarah pretended that she didn't understand at all, so she asked again, but the man didn't bother to repeat anything, just continued dragging the huge bathtub. But at that moment a wagon came to them, and two men got out. One of them asked if it was true that the blue blood was there. Lawrence, when he saw this, was immediately wary and realized that the accident incident had gotten them a long way in the end. The man's partner, who had just arrived, immediately inquired, "Does he mean to say that they might have indisputable evidence?" However, the latter, only smiling smugly, replied that without proof, the whole epic would be regarded as disrespecting the nobility, which for a moment was a huge crime. The girl only smiled at this, and afterward, striking Lawrence, replied that she was in very great anticipation. The guy, who was already barely standing with the huge tub, finally did get it into the building, and Serrer followed him. In fact, it was already the day of the trial itself. And sometime before that, as soon as Serrer woke up, she asked her partner in surprise, did he really think she had died because of the water? The man said that initially they came to the wrong conclusions, because usually at the mention of death in water, but he comes only drowning. And indeed, how could it be otherwise? And that's why, when the autopsy showed no water, they started looking for something else. But Naod said that in fact the whole truth lay in the pipe itself. That was Norman Lest's purpose. The whole mystery was solved. The man said that he wanted to make them think as if it was all about drowning. However, that was not the case at all. And that day in court, Lawrence brought that bathroom just in time for the hearing. And when the girl told the whole story to the court, he wondered, did she really think it was a laryngeal spasm? Serrer had specially prepared this bath to demonstrate everything clearly, and said that most living creatures have their breathing blocked when water enters the nasopharynx. She walked over to the bathroom and dipped her hand in there and said that's why their body tries to save them when water touches this system. Thus, it temporarily closes the larynx. However, because of this, air, as it is not difficult to guess, does not flow into the human body. Even if for a moment, however, the person will not be able to breathe, and such a moment is more than enough to cause the instantaneous death of the person. She smiled and said that it was a pretty basic cause of death by water torture. But at least that's what the doctors say, because she can't know for sure. The people in the audience were very surprised to hear this, for it sounded rather ominous. And the girl went on with her story, and said that they apparently believed that the death was an accident, and if she had really just choked to death, they might as well call it a day. Except that laryngeal spasm occurs as a result of violent acts, when someone forces the victim to dive right in against their will. She also said that in a second autopsy, she found evidence of laryngeal spasm. Those were the exact words the doctor gave her. At this point, the other lawyer suddenly slammed his fist on the table and said that this is absolutely not evidence. He suddenly rose from his seat and began to shout loudly, asking, did she really think a grown man, being completely free, would allow himself to be suddenly, even without resistance, dunked in water? He argued that it was quite impossible to do so, went to the judge, and said that even though this was the real cause of death, it certainly did not prove the fact of murder. The judge, after hearing both sides, said that Blue Blood would then have to take responsibility for his words and explain how the defendant was connected to the incident. Serrer was very surprised to hear this and wondered if that wasn't enough for them. And then, with a heavy sigh, she said that there had been a wedding, a new bride, a death in the bathtub. A scenario like that 3 times already, and they hadn't noticed it at all. And on top of all that, all 3 of Norman's women may have been richer than he was. Perhaps the cause of the accident is, of course, not known for certain. However, this is only if there are more than 2 people involved, and it is no longer an accident, but a murder. Then, all of a sudden, the lawyer started ranting again, saying that Blue Blood was accusing the man without any basis or evidence. Their boss, who was sitting next to Lawrence, sighed heavily and said, "This trial is a mess. All everyone does is yell, and they don't want to deal with the truth." At this point, Lawrence rose from his seat and said that by the time defendant Norman Lest saw the victim, she was already dead. And besides, there is evidence of his whereabouts at the time of the girl's death. He was in the bedroom. When the attorney said this, Lawrence inquired whether his words were reliable at all and how he could verify them. The man smiled cheerfully and said that of course they were not given by the defendant's employees, but by his late wife's employees. They could not side with the husband employer, making them important witnesses. Serrer, when she heard this, immediately smiled and said that it was all nonsense and asked that they end it there. The judge said that from now on everything they said would be evidence of Norman Lest's crime. Then suddenly the girl asked for everyone's attention, for already people were starting to talk, and said that as an experiment, they would dip blue blood investigator Lorenzo Dominic into the water as a visual demonstration. When people heard this, they were very surprised. They could not believe that they would actually take such a step. While Sarah had just woken up and heard the whole situation, she said she was clear. However, she did not understand how on earth they could explain it in the courtroom. Lawrence looked at her in surprise and said he didn't understand what the problem was. After all, they had solid evidence, and even the cause of death had been established. However, the commander, smiling, said that their evidence was not physical, so we'll have to explain in words. But there's still a limit to what can be said. The girl knew very well how the garden system worked, so she said that you could throw words around as much as you wanted. However, all you would get in response would be incomprehensible phrases, and the meeting would be closed. To be clear, she said that she could, for example, simply talk about the sexuality of a certain man. However, if he could see him in person, the reaction would be completely different. And that's when we can confirm that he's very handsome and attractive. Lawrence understood perfectly well what she was getting at. However, he did not like the example at all. But the girl replied that, simply put, there must be something to be felt, so that it was not just mere words when they would talk about it. She thought about something for a while. Then she pointed her finger at Lorenzo and asked why he was wet if she was drowning. The man sighed heavily, said it was all because she was the one who had been diligently pouring water on him before she started to drown. The girl, then smiling, said she was sorry he had dived me whole, for she was enduring so much agony because of him. At that moment, a simply brilliant thought came into the girl's head, so she froze and didn't even move. When the man saw the look on her face, he asked in surprise, "What's wrong with her?" At that moment, she lowered her head as if she had lost consciousness. Lorenzo immediately walked over to his boss, and then she looked up, grabbing his hand and asking if he would help her after all. And so, after a time at the court hearing, he really had to help her. However, at that moment he suddenly felt a little scared, and he thought she was some kind of witch. Then the judge suddenly inquired, "What is the purpose of the dip, and also what does all this even mean?" Sarah said that's what it means. Right at that moment, Lorenzo Dominic will be in the water. She looked at the man and hoped very much that he himself knew he had to stay put. And Lorenz had the most genuine panic in his head at this point. When she saw the look on his face, she immediately came closer and whispered something in his ear. Afterward, she stepped back and smiled. For a while she just stood there, and then she kicked him right in the knee with all her strength so that the man couldn't stay on his feet. Lorenzo immediately fell into the water and just lay there. He could hear her voice saying that he shouldn't worry, but in fact the man thought the whole endeavor was sheer madness. The girl then told him that no one was going to kill him, and he thought about the fact that this phrase really calmed him down and thought it was all a witch's trick. The man continued to be underwater, and the judge and the rest of the jury were getting worried about it because he hadn't even surfaced. All this spectacle didn't last long, however. It wasn't long before Sarah pulled a man out of the bathroom who was still terrified. After that, a lawyer's voice was heard who asked what was going on at all, and also reminded them that they were still in the court session. Therefore, it is necessary to observe some norms of decency. But the girl, laughing, said that anything was quite possible, and also inquired if they were observing one very interesting oddity. Without waiting for an answer, she said that up to that point, Lorenzo Dominic had not resisted her. The lawyer said that it was because she had forced him to do it. Sarah replied that everything was perfectly correct. However, just to confirm her words, she also told Mr. Lawyer that if he started drowning him, he would certainly not tolerate such a thing. And then she offered to look again at their arguments and asked why an adult who had been completely free up to that point had behaved calmly. She said that this behavior was a demonstration of complete trust. He was well aware that she had no intention of harming him. Look at the other jurors," she said, "that she thinks everyone should realize this. The last thing a young wife expects is to be threatened by her loving spouse." The judge spoke then and inquired as to her explanation of the evidence on the defendant's part in such a case. Sarah said that in that case she would like to ask only one question. The judge, of course, allowed her to do so. And then the girl, looking directly at the lawyer, inquired how an employee could tell about his employer's first wedding night. For example, calmly pointing to the defendant's location at the time of the incident and looking directly at the man who was sitting next to the attorney, she asked, "Is it true that this is rather odd?" She approached this guy and also added that this could only happen if she was with the defendant. Of course, she doesn't understand how Lady Kate could like this man. Sure, maybe he's handsome and his family fell a long time ago, but still. This girl's maidservants were also puzzled as to how the girl could have chosen this man, for this was even her third marriage. The previous wives had died under unclear circumstances. The elder lord was also against it. He almost had a stroke when he heard the news. The maids speculated that perhaps he was really good in bed, and that was the reason she had chosen him. But at that moment, this Norman came up to them all of a sudden. He said he wanted to decorate their skate room and asked if they could help him. The maids, bowing, said at once that everything would be done, while they themselves were very anxious as to whether the man had heard their conversation or not. Norman said that when she takes a bath and comes out, you have to get her into a nice room because she has accepted him for who he is and he wants to make her a very happy woman, so one must try to do one's best. The servant girl immediately stepped forward and said that she had served mistress the longest, so she felt that the man could rely on her. She, also smiling, offered to go with him to the room, so that there he could tell her everything, all the details of how he would like to see her. Norman immediately thanked her and told her that mistress really liked the smell of roses, so it was worth sprinkling the bed with petals. And the maid said that she also liked red wine with apples, so she would be sure to bring them. But then, suddenly, Norman came close to her and, running his hand through her hair, said that it was so red, just like Kate's. He moved closer and closer to the maid and said that he wanted to know before she came if he could perform one very important and responsible experiment. When the maid heard all this, she was immediately alarmed. She even began to tremble with fear, for she knew that this was not going to be a good thing. And some time later his wife was dead. Her father came to him and asked him how he dared to do such a thing to his daughter in the first place. Norman then, stammering, said that he himself did not understand what the reason was. Before Kate came out of the bathroom, they were decorating the room with the maid. At this point, the man started yelling and told the man not to lie, because his daughter could not have done such a thing on her own. At this point, the maid immediately started shouting and said that she had seen everything for herself. She had come to help decorate the room as the gentleman had requested a few days ago. And it was then that this terrible tragedy happened to the lady. They had absolutely nothing to do with it. Sarah, holding the papers up, said that the nickname Prodigal Son had been tacked onto Norman by society for a reason. Through this, she had gotten one very important clue in the case. She put the papers on the table and said that most of the inheritance went to support his aristocrats. This situation is very complicated, however. It might not be murder, but just treason. Suddenly his counsel cried out and asked what kind of sophistry this was. It was a very crude suggestion, that's all. Therefore, turning to Mr. Judge, he said that he protested and asked that the witness be quieted. The man studied the papers for a while and then ordered them to summon the maid and interrogate her. After all, they finally had a result, and then, striking the table with a small gavel, he said that this was the end of the first session. The guards took Norman under his arms and began to lead him away, and the judge set a date for a second hearing and also said there would be a hearing. After it was all over, the girl was approached by her boss and told that she had done a very good job and was just delightful. Zerer, smiling, said that perhaps that was indeed the case. It was not long before the circumstances under which Norman had seduced the maid and brought her to the bedroom were recorded at the second session after the questioning of Keith's maids. What was the situation with Lest's past wives? So all the cases were not such a coincidence. Thus, the defendant was convicted of murder. As a result, the case of the drowned bride that had once made a splash in secular society was finally concluded, and the whole truth about Norman was revealed. After the case is finally closed, Sarah, of course, went with her co-workers to celebrate her victory. Soon a waiter from the bar they had come to rest at came over and told them that the largest size beer had been made. The girl immediately thanked him, and the man asked in surprise, "Is this really a celebration of victory or consolation after defeat?" She looked at him in surprise and immediately asked what he was talking about. The bartender pointed to an article in the newspaper and said it was about that. He also added that the rumors must have spread pretty quickly, and also added that if the toast is celebratory, he might even treat them. Serrer, who absolutely hated extra attention, immediately said that he could certainly oblige, for she lived simply for the taste, and the girl immediately laughed. As they drank some beer, she turned to Naod and wondered where their youngest, Lorenzo, was, since it was just them and the commander. Her younger partner replied that she herself had left him alone and was now suddenly looking for him, and added that it probably wouldn't get better for their friend until the next morning for sure. Naod said that of course he had better stay asleep, for perhaps then some prince would come and wake him up, and they would live happily ever after, just like in all the fairy tales. Sarah wished to change the topic of conversation and said that it was only because of his high sacrifice that they had finally managed to twist Norman, so he was entitled to rest. The guy immediately brought it up and said that he didn't understand why she had asked him to reinvestigate Norman's past. When their supervisor heard this, he looked at the girl in surprise and asked if she had really asked. Naud had looked at him and said that this was indeed true. She had asked to know about Norman's fortunes before the wedding, who he had dated, where he went, and all sorts of other things. He also added that if you look closely at the situation, their family was broke. They were literally living on the streets, but at some point dramatically appeared in social circles. Sarah agreed with her partner and said that he must have met with some person after which he was returned to society. Moreover, the emperor, for some unknown reason, granted Norman the title of aristocrat again, and the data about this event ended up being destroyed. The girl, thinking, said that a beggar who had been begging on the streets had somehow become an aristocrat overnight. The women who came to him on the Axis all as one said they met and dated him before the family broke up. The man said they picked up and just left him in his time of need, so suggested it could well be revenge. The girl answered nothing to this, immediately thinking about the whole situation. The family had gone bankrupt. The property was all gone. Only from something he was not satisfied with the return of his position and property, until he seduced innocent women in order to kill them, taking all their property for himself. Norman, a man whose family went bankrupt because of his involvement with political aristocrats, committed a crime to bribe another political aristocrat. Sarah was well aware that something about this situation was suspicious and hoped she wasn't missing anything. Oh, and besides, the man had been very thorough in cleaning up his tracks. Naud suddenly wondered what the point of paying politicians was, so he added that he was first going to research where Norman frequented. He also asked that they all agree with him about the case being quite strange, so it should be investigated even more thoroughly. Their boss said he still gets various calls from management about him, and now that the aristocrat's murder trial is legal, there's talk that Norman's case is being handled by Blaine Blood. As soon as the guy heard this, he was very surprised and asked, "Is it really Blaine?" After all, he didn't realize how he could have ended up in all this. Naud turned to the girl and said that if this department had taken over the case on a permanent basis, then it would appear that what they had feared had come to pass after all. Blaine Blood is actually the department behind the Blue Bloods and White Bloods. Their symbol is an engraved crown pattern, which means a pretty obvious thing. The 30 Years' Civil War is widely known as the war between the Royalists and the rebels. However, it actually turned out to be a power struggle between the military and politicians that was even tougher than other wars. The emperor, who lived under political pressure, managed to change the government after a long war, However, under great pressure from them, he himself went insane, losing trust even in himself. He is the one who created the agency that has the power to punish those who oppose him, which is why everyone thinks this emperor is pretty much cruel and doesn't accept his actions. Naud looked at the chief and said that these officials were not all rebels after all. The man replied that anyone could see that he was trying to steal a large sum from the inheritance. In addition, the trick had been pulled 3 times, so naturally the situation had been taken into consideration. He also said that there was some talk that there were still some insurgents left, which is why this department was not disbanded. Naud sighed heavily and said that Otto had thought they would get a bonus for investigating the nobles, but it didn't end up the way he had hoped. He also said that at this rate he would definitely resign soon, but then suddenly a peanut flew into his head, and he immediately fell silent. The men looked around in surprise, and when they saw that the girl had done it, they immediately became indignant. But she, without giving any sign, asked for some more beer to be brought to them. After that, Sarah picked up Peanut and asked what he was even talking nonsense about, because she really didn't understand why he was thinking so horribly. The girl said that if they took on such an endeavor without support, they would be getting into the wrong places. She then squeezed the peanuts so that they shattered into small pieces, and pointing to the remnants, said that their fate would be the same if they really did what he wanted. Naud, seeing this, became very frightened. Then the girl, lowering her gaze, said that it was the best solution to avoid a useless headache. In fact, Frederick III declared the end of the war after the incident and returned to the capital. There he also alerted everyone to the disappearance of their heroine Jeanne d'Arc, and displaying a mangled arm, said he had lost it in the struggle for their peace and well-being. After all, the girl would have to face him again sooner or later, no matter how much she didn't want to. In fact, Jeanne will be forgotten by absolutely many residents, however not by the emperor. He will remember her for the rest of his days. Suddenly the girl was torn from her thoughts by the waiter, who brought another beer for her and put it on the table with a clatter. The girl even jumped a little from surprise. Then she suddenly thought about her assistant. She wondered where Schwartz had gone after all that had happened. At that moment, the doors to the bar opened and a very irritated and angry Lorenzo flew in. He quickly walked over to Serere and said that he had indeed dropped her in the water. However, after all, she was the one who started it first. And besides, he didn't do it on purpose, and this kind of attitude really annoyed him. At that moment, the man started coming closer and closer to her, and soon, when their faces were opposite each other and they were looking at each other with very intense glances, he asked why only he was being treated like this. Sarah then moved a short distance away from him and asked what was wrong with his expression. Was this really his first kiss? And was that why he was reacting so violently? But when Lorenzo heard this, his cheeks just started to blaze, and he immediately averted his gaze from her because he was very uncomfortable with this conversation. As soon as the girl saw his reaction and the fact that his whole body started to tremble, she realized that apparently it was indeed true, and she even felt a little ashamed of her words. The man was so thoroughly pissed off that he even started strangling her. In fact, they weren't alone in the bar. Their entire blue blood department was gathered there. One of the men turned to their boss and asked, shouldn't they be separated? They would tear up the whole bar that way. However, he only smiled and told him not to pay attention to them because they acted like this all the time, so there was definitely nothing to worry about. They'll have a fight soon enough. Lorenzo kept choking the girl and the guy kept pushing his point and said that if they kept acting like this, there would be the ultimate mayhem. His boss, continuing to drink his alcohol, said it was okay for them to indulge because pretty soon they wouldn't be able to behave like this anymore, so they should give them some leeway. When the guy heard this, he immediately asked his boss why they couldn't do that anymore. He explained that, as it was said, there was a new head of the department, which means that from now on, they will have to change their behavior to avoid looking stupid. At this point, Sarah, as expected, laid Lorenzo on his shoulder blades, thus demonstrating his strength. The man went on to tell his assistant that Campbell said a not at all unusual person would be arriving. He had even heard of one of the capital's highest aristocracy. Many say he was the second officer of the heroine Joan of Arc. As soon as the guy heard it, he immediately remembered his name and said it would probably be Schwartz Borden. Once upon a time, there was a boy whose family had power and money. He could do absolutely anything he wanted. At that time, the Civil War was in full swing. The entire empire was in trouble, which no one knew how to deal with. This little boy was Norman, and he used to have wooden sword duels with other children for fun. And then one sunny afternoon, he still managed to defeat Adolf Seol and was incredibly proud of it. The girls who had gathered behind him immediately started congratulating him and saying that it was all only because of Norman. But in reality, for the boy, it was just another distant story. He did not go into all these details of the war, but lived his life. As soon as the bout was over, the girl and the guy came closer to him and said it was just unbelievable. They couldn't understand how Norman managed to strategize so well that he always won. And in the first few minutes of the fight, too, the boy held his head up, said he was doing everything exactly as his father had taught him. He said that in war, a soldier must make a good plan to get the upper hand on his enemy. And it is for this reason that they can overpower military men who can only swing their fists. Once the children heard this, Norman became even a level higher for them. They were simply enthralled by his stories. And after that, a girl with yellow hair suddenly came up behind him and apologized to him for being distracting. In fact, she was incredibly embarrassed, so she asked that he accept a gift from her in honor of her winnings and said it all quickly and also with a flushed face. She handed him a box and said that she had made it all with her own hands. After that, another girl and a few others came up and they began to give him their congratulations and the gifts they had prepared. And the girl who was on his team immediately became on his defense and began to chase these strangers away because she was very jealous. At that very moment, the letter carrier came to their house, and the butler went out to fetch the letter. As soon as he took it in his hands and read to whom it was addressed, he was immediately frightened. The man grabbed the letter in his hands and immediately ran towards the manor. When Norman noticed this, he was very surprised, for it was the first time he had ever seen a butler in such a hurry. The boy was a little worried and even thought that something serious had happened, for this was indeed an abnormal occurrence for their butler. The butler immediately went to the gentleman and handed him the letter. The man asked in astonishment, "Did some golden-haired saint really appear?" He also asked the man where the child was even from. The guy apologized and said that, of course, he did not have such information. After pondering for a while, the gentleman, smoking a cigar, said that it must be the child of a mercenary who had suddenly appeared from somewhere. And Norman, who was running past them at the time, heard it, and he's had a streak of bad luck ever since. Shortly afterward, when Norman was a little older, his father was just furious. He threw things around and said it was out of the question. The butler, when he saw him in such a state, asked him to calm down a bit. But the man insisted and said that to change all the plans because of one girl made no sense at all, and there was no use in such an idea. His assistant ran into the room and said that all the investors were going to take their investments right then and there. But the man shouted and asked him to just shut up because he didn't want to hear any of this. He didn't understand how they dared to run away without even trying to offer resistance. That was what irritated the man the most. Norman, who had grown up reading newspapers by then, realized that the saintly heroine had scored another victory, and the headlines went around asking how great her level of fencing was now. It said that the family, which had recently joined the military government, was a key source of funding for the politicians' power, and questioned whether a new government would be established after the end of the 30-year regime. Thus, that golden-haired Joan of Arc appeared in their country. The precise strategy and countless weapons put forward by the opposing forces, the girl's swordsmanship skills made all their efforts pointless. And her abilities easily ruined Norman's peaceful life, even if she didn't have that on her mind. Soon after reading all the news, the man went back to his friends and said that the money he borrowed last time would not be able to pay back right away. And his friends turned around and started walking away and said he didn't need a refund. Norman became a completely different person, and those people he considered friends began to turn away from him. The girls mocked and scolded him for his appearance, for he looked wrinkled, and his clothes were very shabby indeed. People didn't understand how he could come into decent society dressed like that. Someone even said that his clothes resembled those of a butler. Then the girl, suddenly laughing, said that perhaps if he was holding on to the glory of his past, he had no choice but to wear those old clothes. This then made Norman very angry. He went at once to his father, who was in despair, and said that many people were saying that the head of the family, who was under their protection, had suddenly disappeared. He also said that if they surrendered to the Seal family right now, they might still be able to save the whole situation. But his father insisted and said it was all nonsense and the other swordsmen were lying at their feet, so they definitely couldn't do it. Also, the man kept shouting, asking who had supported this country until then, and didn't understand how they could be treated like this now, even though they had saved it with their last strength. Some more time passed from that moment. Norman had grown up completely, and the news came that the Civil War was finally over. People were incredibly happy that the war was finally over, and they were also talking about His Majesty, the Emperor, and the soldiers of Seoul returning to the capital at last. As soon as Norman heard the news, he immediately ran to his father and told him that the war was over. So he told him that the emperors and soldiers were returning, and they must flee urgently to save themselves and their pride. But that afternoon, when Norman came home, no one was there. He was thrown into a cold sweat, all his hands trembling. He was well aware that none of this was going to end well. He went to his father's room, and in the end, loyalty or pride broke their family. But if you think about it that way, such trivial feelings actually had nothing to do with the situation. He probably understood that the Lest family, which was the center of politicians and aristocrats, despite all the merits, would definitely not be able to survive. His father didn't want to fight, so he chose to take the easy way out. He just got drunk and his heart stopped. Thus the man threw all the problems they had formed onto his son, who understood absolutely nothing about it. At this very time, Norman was in the papa to relax a bit. Then the door opened, and some man came in, and he was wearing a hoodie, and it was completely impossible to see his face. And the bartender said it was the first time he had seen him. The man also asked him what he wanted. But he did not answer, but went to the table where Norman was sitting. The guy, who was a friend of his, inquired, "Does he really want to know how to make a woman be his in a heartbeat?" And Norman replied that that's why he lives in this place. He has nothing to lose, so he's willing to do the lowest things. At this point, the man who approached them said in a quiet voice that he never thought Norman would be in Kenkyle. Smiling, he said he was very happy to finally meet Mr. Norman. Soon Norman's friend left, and this stranger took his place. The bartender brought them drinks in 2 new glasses. The man said it was the best drink in the place, and after that started to leave. They, getting acquainted, held out their hands to Norman and said that in that case, they could have a drink and get started. Norman immediately began to panic, for the skills he had demonstrated scared him very much. Some time before, the stranger had been able to put down Norman, who was about to run away with a single blow. He also said that he found it hard to understand why the men were so surprised. However, he should not worry at all, because he is not from the village. Norman looked at the guy again in surprise and immediately wondered how he'd even found him. The hooded guy, however, smiled and asked, making Norman start by asking why he was looking for him in the first place. He also added that this story would be many times more interesting. Norman didn't answer anything. He continued to look at the man in surprise. The guy was really very afraid. Then the man wanted to start at the end and said they would help him become a lord again. However, they need someone who will be their eyes and ears among the aristocracy, and that is why they made such a request of Norman. He also said that, unfortunately, the guy at that point had no allies to lend a hand. Even though everything happened a few years ago, he's not sure Norman is comfortable with just remembering the past. Norman, whose hand was covered in scars, touched the alcohol and asked if he even knew who he used to be. At this point, the stranger spoke up and said that he couldn't put his finger on the tip of his shoe. He then tipped a glass of liquor and wondered if Norman had ever tasted anything more expensive than this cheap liquor. Norman immediately started yelling and throwing himself at the guy, and after he took off his hood, he just smiled and asked Norman not to get so angry. The man replied that it's all because he's like Norman, also stuck in his past and can't get out. As soon as the man saw the expression on this guy's face, he was very frightened, for he had a bandaged eye, as well as scars everywhere. He let it go rather quickly, and in turn, he said that people whisper, "Stop thinking about the past. Focus on the future and the present." The stranger also added that only if they had a past that couldn't be forgotten like the two of them, they wouldn't even dare to say a word about it. In fact, this stranger was the poor guy whom the emperor had left to burn alive and who had tried to take the emperor hostage. However, things didn't work out so well. Norman, listening to him, suddenly became very panicky. He did not answer him, but thought about what to do next. The stranger reached forward and asked him if they would prove that the past should not be forgotten at all. Smiling, the poor guy said they needed to make the future the past, and by committing to it, rather than informing everyone who was right in reality. Some time had passed since they had put their plan into action, and Norman met up with his new friend again. As soon as the guy came to him, that man got very excited and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time and that he was glad to finally meet. Also, turning to Norman, he said that he had lost some weight. He poured him alcohol and asked him how he was doing. So he said Angela was worried too, so he asked that he contact him as often as possible. Suddenly, Norman turned to him in a gruff voice and asked why he had called him. After all, he had said he could not attend, but he insisted on being there anyway. He said that was why he had not come to this place himself. Now, however, there was something he needed to check. He called another man they were working with and didn't understand why they had sent Norman to the most certain death. The man also said that they should have covered it up because he was relaying orders to them. However, he said that they tried, but things did not work out as they had hoped. The guy who came to meet that crippled resident said that that woman didn't stop until the very end. When he heard about the woman, he immediately asked who he meant. Of course, the man was referring to Serer, who was very serious. And the man with the patch over his eye wondered if he was really talking about the red-haired woman he had mentioned last time. The guy immediately said that this is really true. She doesn't take orders from her superiors. If something goes wrong because of him, he doesn't know what to do. At this point, the man immediately laughed and said that he had not called him for a reprimand. Of course, Norman had given his all for them. However, now was the time for them to begin the main part of the plan. He said they would train the enlisted soldiers little by little where no one would suspect anything, and that was why they had talked even before with Norman. The guy with the bandage said that they would need his help for that very purpose as well, and asked if he could do it. Norman was immediately excited and told the gentleman that this was a big part of it for him, so of course they proceeded with this plan. The man with the eye patch smiled and said that Norman had trapped himself, so it was definitely not their fault. And also from the very beginning he was worried that their opinion would disagree, but apparently he just took the situation too keenly. And the guy who came to him, hearing all this, smiled and said that apparently the misunderstanding had been cleared up. The man also said that he could be sure that his mission would not be forgotten, so he might not worry. And the guy who came to him said he was on a quest to find the golden-haired Joan of Arc. The man raised his hands in the air and said it was true, for she was a saint who had come to save them. The image of her was clearer to him than the image of his dead family. He was a little more memorable even than the faces of his friends, who were engulfed in flames the day he was almost burned too. Her beautiful golden hair he would certainly never forget, so he asked his assistant to bring Jeanne before the emperor captured her. He asked that a fellow named Howard Gamey take up the matter, and the man, of course, did not object. Some more time had passed since then, and Naod was sitting in his office dozing after their successful court appearance. Soon he was awakened by the alarm clock, which he had specially set, and as soon as the guy woke up, he immediately took up the kettle, which stood nearby. As soon as he poured himself some tea, he immediately began to enjoy it, and thought that it was just what he needed after a hard day's work. But at that moment Serer ran into his office, breathing very heavily. She quickly slammed the door behind her, thus disturbing the poor man's idea. The girl said she must be getting old, because she had a hangover from only 4 bottles of liquor, and she had never had one like this before. She immediately walked over to her partner and asked, was this really the honey water she had been thinking about all along? Naud started yelling at her, telling her to go away, because she smelled of alcohol. He was not a man who had been drinking water, but green tea, which he had brewed for himself. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked, did he really brew again and eat his leaves afterward? Naud, angry, shouted and said it was green tea and she should put them in it. Enough time had come since the incident and he didn't understand. Was she still drinking alcohol? Serer sat down across from him and said that at times like this, you have to push a little harder. The girl also said that they get sick to their stomachs when such incidents happen. They are also the department that the nobles pay attention to. So as long as it's quiet, they can enjoy themselves as much as they want. That's it. That's the rule she follows. Naud didn't argue with her and also wondered why she looked a little different. Was she going somewhere? She looked at him in surprise and asked, doesn't he know about it? The boy really didn't know what she was talking about, but someone outside suddenly started shouting, interrupting them. Sarah then explained that if you think of it that way, it's really noisy outside and he really doesn't know, so she advised that at least once a week he reads the newspaper. Then she explained that the whole commotion was because of the Pentaville Ripper. People were standing under their building and protesting. They called the investigation incompetent on the part of the police and asked for a review of the case. Naud asked, is she really talking about the neighborhood next to the slums? The girl said that's right. 5 people died there. All the organs were taken out one by one, and each one had a different one. He was popularly known as the common Jack the Ripper. The incident, which took place several hundred years ago, dates back to an old era when 5 women died, leaving behind only questions. But there was enough in common: poor women, serial killings, and a botched investigation by the police. Thus, people called the perpetrator a ripper without realizing it. At first, everyone was indifferent to what was happening, but after the 5th victim was found, people started calling the police. Naud immediately remembered the story and started telling it to his girlfriend. And afterward, he also added that it could happen even outside of Pentaville. Sarah, of course, did not know such details, but she wasn't interested in them, so she pretended to sleep. Then the fellow continued his story and said that the incident was not a crime among the nobles. It wasn't even a matter of their jurisdiction. At that moment, some new guy suddenly came into their office, and he turned to Naud and asked if they had everything ready. The man thought that it was Lorenzo, so he already wanted to say hello to him, but as soon as he saw the guy, he immediately stopped, because he looked completely different. Serer was immediately interested, for the boy had called him handsome, and the girl looked at Lorenzo, for he looked different. The girl was silent for a while and then, smiling, said that transforming a person was not a crime at all. So you can't condemn him for it. Lorenzo, looking at her in surprise, asked, is that such a compliment? And she in turn called him a real fox. The boy decided not to pursue the subject further, so he stopped and inquired, aren't they packed yet? The girl immediately inquired where they were supposed to be going. Lorenzo was surprised that she didn't already know, and said that the new branch manager would be arriving that day. When Naud heard that, he turned to the girl and said that he had just realized that he had forgotten to tell her something else. Serer, leaning against the back of her couch, immediately said that she couldn't go. Lorenzo, of course, had foreseen this situation, so he said that those who didn't show up before checking the list of employees would have their salaries cut. When she heard this, she immediately became indignant and said that if a supervisor like all the previous ones came to replace her, she would not be satisfied at all. Naud didn't listen to her and told her to wash her face first and go back inside, because the new headmaster had a lot of influence in the society, and looking sloppy wouldn't do them any good at all. When she heard this, she was a bit even surprised and asked how huge his power was. Is he really an aristocrat from the political world? The man said at once that he was one of the Boredom family, an honored member of the 30 Years' Civil War. He had also heard that he was the older brother of the present head of the family. Naode, after thinking about it, said that since he was one of the central political aristocrats, it meant that he was also from the highest. For a while the boy tried to remember his name, and then finally said his name was Schwartz Borden. When the girl heard that name, she was very surprised. After all, this man was her old partner, and when she ran away, she didn't even say goodbye to him. The girl could not imagine that this man would be her boss. She immediately grabbed her coat and was about to leave as soon as possible. Naud pounced on her leg and told her that she couldn't do that. If she didn't show up, his salary would be cut too. However, the girl was not interested in all this, because now the one who had been her subordinate for 10 years would become her direct superior, whom she should logically obey. The Borden family is the central force of the military aristocracy that played a major role in the Civil War, and among them is Schwartz, the eldest son. And this man went to a place not much different from places of exile for nobles. This surprised the girl madly, for she did not think that he could have agreed to such a job. It seemed to her that she had discarded everything forever, her name and her past. But now it was catching up with her again, and those memories were closing in on the girl, making her feel uncomfortable inside. Serere couldn't understand why he had appeared in front of her. The girl had a lot of different ideas in her head, and it even gave her a bit of a headache. So soon after some more reflection, she decided that she didn't need to torture herself with these thoughts anymore, because they were of no use anyway. The girl had put on a cloak right across her height, and a special hat so that her face would not be seen. She was going to linger in the cafe for an hour or two. She thought that the ceremony would be over by then. But at that moment a passing car was carrying their boss, who recognized her immediately and asked where she was going. The inauguration was about to begin, and she needed to be there. The girl, startled, immediately turned around and saw him. She wondered how he even recognized her, for Serere, in her opinion, had disguised herself well. She really thought that wearing a floor-length cloak and a hat on top would be enough of a disguise. Her boss, however, wondered what it was all about, for he recognized her at first sight, and such a disguise was quite unlike a professional one. At that moment, another man got out of the car. It was Schwartz. He asked, "Is there a problem?" He was addressing her boss, who had agreed to let him down. Serere immediately froze when she saw the man. She couldn't even take her eyes off him and thought about how he hadn't changed at all since she'd known him. Then, the girl realized that she needed to cover her face with her hands. She quickly turned around and said that she was going to see what had happened, so she was going to go because she wouldn't make it in time. But her boss was very surprised and asked what kind of incident we were even talking about. He was about to follow her, but the girl quickened her step. Sarah was about to cross the road when she suddenly tripped on the curb because she was in her own thoughts and immediately began to fall. She couldn't keep her balance, so she was almost to the pavement. But at that moment, someone grabbed her by the back of her cloak. She immediately turned her head to the side to see who it was. Of course, the man was Schwartz. He let her go and, looking at her face in surprise, asked if she was really Mrs. Jean. Even though the man hadn't changed at all, there was still one distinguishing feature. He had a huge scar right across his eye that showed his hard history that had happened all this time.